I'm president and CEO of an organization called the National Design Alliance. And our principal program is called Reimagine America's Schools. Our focus at Reimagine America Schools is on working directly with communities and school districts to help them implement the changes that they seek. Our work concentrates on creating impactful infrastructure and the design of learning environments that are aligned with educational objectives. Prior to the pandemic, we were focused chiefly on active and inquiry-based learning, STEM, STEAM, maker learning, and so forth, as drivers of change in education, infrastructure, and design. During COVID-19, we have added other drivers of change, including issues of equity and systemic racism in our communities and schools, the changes being driven by technology, and the need to better understand how schools can more effectively be repurposed to serve communities in times of crisis and emergencies. In the end, of course, all of these and other drivers of change must be integrated into singular strategies. Because of our bias for tangible, implementable strategies, we have decided to focus on community schools as a recommended way for cities and districts to address educational equity issues in their communities. And we view today's conversation as the beginning of a longer dialogue, which will take a look at the current status of the community school movement and build on the success of the past by reimagining America's community schools. I want to thank today's panelists for joining us, and to Tony Smith, who I'll introduce in a minute, for helping us plan this convening. But let's take a minute to meet our panelists. Not in any particular order: Steve Bingler, architect and founder and CEO of Concordia; Celine Coggins, executive director, Grantmakers for Education; Ashley Flores, senior director, the Child Poverty Action Lab; Paul Gotthold, San Diego County Superintendent of Schools; David Muhammad, executive director, National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform; Jose Munoz, director, Coalition for Community Schools and vice president, Equity and Impact for the Institute for Educational Leadership; Pedro Rivera, Pennsylvania Secretary of Education at the Pennsylvania Department of Education; Mallow Hudson, associate professor in urban planning at Columbia University; and Alina Silver, director, pre-K education at New America. Tony Smith, a remarkable individual, high energy, as you'll see, is founder of Wise People, that's WHYS, where he provides strategic advising and executive coaching for thriving communities. Tony is the former state superintendent of education in Illinois and has a rich history as leader of school districts where he has broadly implemented community schools with great success. Tony has also helped us frame today's dialogue and, as the panelists know, has helped curate the participants in today's forum. Thanks, Tony, for joining us on this important conversation. And now we look to you to lead us in reimagining schools with Community Schools 3.0. Take it away.
Thank you, Ron. It really is a pleasure to be here and to have this really remarkable group gathered. It's kind of a launch of a new kind of conversation that brings practitioners from a broad range of areas around this idea that creating learning environments, kind of learning anywhere, anytime, and supporting that is a transformative act, and creating those conditions in new ways helps to kind of deconstruct and unpack the unfortunate and ongoing policy of white supremacy in the United States. And the schools have built up a practice of harming and excluding some while it concentrates privilege for others. And I think today we're going to go into specific expertise and kind of draw that together from different people's perspectives, and then begin to imagine what a 3.0 might look like, and how we could think about shared policy that creates a place of healthy belonging for every child and their family, so that we have economic security, housing security, that we're actually whole, healthy humans and nested in systems of care and concern. So we're going to move through the panel kind of with some initial conversation, initial questions to them, and then they're going to engage in some dialogue, listening to things that come up for them about how we would design for the future and what more integrated systems of care and concern could look like. And before we do that, I did want to read a quote from Sonia Renee Taylor that just as a reminder about the moment we're in and the opportunity we have. She says, "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal other than we normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature." And it's kind of with that aspiration that we would knit a new garment that will launch into these questions. And Mala, we're going to start with you. And I kind of turn to you to say, what role do you think community engagement plays in creating healthy community? And we've kind of been having these conversations for more than 25 years, and you've been leading and doing extraordinary work. So curious what you think the role of community engagement has to shaping this new future.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be here and for that great question. I think when we think of community schools, I mean, community is at the heart of it, right? And oftentimes the way schools have been run is sort of us versus them, and parents don't feel as welcome. And so I think when we think about a community and community engagement, it really is knocking on the doors of everyone intergenerationally. It's reaching out to those who maybe have been formerly incarcerated. It's reaching out to all the people that really contribute to the entire neighborhood, an entire broader community, and make them feel welcome and figure out their ways for them to contribute. And so from the most basic level, it's understanding who's in the community. From an administrative perspective, certainly we can look at from the census and know who's there, but there's also people who aren't part of that or who may be undocumented or not, under the radar, so to speak. People doubled and tripled up depending on the type of community people are living in and working 2 or 3 jobs. So it's really having an understanding of who makes up the entire community and how we can all contribute to contributing to creating healthier schools, healthier environments, and healthier places.
That's a great start. And being in those relationships and figuring out how to connect. Jose, I'm going to turn to you to pick up on that and kind of ask you, what does it look like to develop those collaborative student family-centered partnerships? And you've had remarkable experience doing it, but kind of when you think about that, what does it take? What does it look like?
What does it look like, Tony? Keeping it simple here. So Ron mentioned in the introduction, and you followed about addressing white supremacy. So we know what it doesn't look like. Having young people of color just come in and sit down, be quiet, stare at the front, focus at one person. We know that's what white supremacy does look like. What it looks like to inform the community is about ownership. How do you invest the time in listening and learning from the very people you want to have a positive outcome, so they become owners of the school themselves. So they're part of sitting at a table consistently, not just at a survey, not just at an assessment, but consistently and collectively designing solutions for them to aspire for hopes and dreams, and solutions to mitigate any barriers from that. So on a local level, in a sense, from a community school standpoint, those that are well ran, this is a local engagement strategy of how do you create the platform that is open for anyone to join, but is intentional about who joins it. Those who have been most marginalized, those who have been most oppressed, and the numbers point to us directly who that is. Black, brown. If you're a minority, if you're Black or brown, and you're poor and you're disabled, you're probably the most oppressed population there is going through a school district. So creating a consistent venue where they not only get assessed, but they actively participate and eventually become the owner of leading their own solutions.
Yeah, full participation and belongingness. I love that. Actually, I'm going to pick this up about some of the connections in community, and given your work and leadership, I'm kind of curious about your thinking about the intersection of housing and education, and how connecting institutions really underpin thriving communities.
I think schools and housing are intimately linked, but so often we pull them apart and miss opportunities for greater impact. And I think that's also true with our public agencies, often work in silos and are working with the same families, working towards the same goals, but aren't connecting the dots across their bodies of work. I think just a very small local example, our continuum of care that's working with people who are experiencing homelessness in Dallas. They have a data system to do sort of this case management process. Well, the Dallas Independent School District has roughly 4,000 students at any given time who are experiencing homelessness. But in the student data system in DISD, there's not a field where you can input the HMIS number, or the number that the continuum of care is using for their case management process, to connect the dots between who Dallas ISD is working with as far as students who've been identified as homeless, and the continuum of care. So that, very simple kind of data silos, if we could bridge that, then the collaborative capacity would be so much greater in service to students and their families who are having a difficult season. And so I think that finding ways for small and big opportunities for collaboration will go so much further in working with our communities.
Yeah, I think the idea that single service and figuring out how to connect care so that families get everything they need. I mean, so there's so much to build on. I appreciate that. David, I'm going to turn to you in terms of the focus on youth, and really thinking about what you've done so well, really taking a strengths-based approach to youth development, and thinking not just about kind of mitigating the harm, but actually designing around opportunities for young people. And just if you could talk about how you work with some of the population that's been most excluded and most marginalized and harmed, and how you're thinking about youth development.
Yeah, no, thank you, and thank you for adding me to this discussion. Good to see you and be back in discussion with you, Tony. And I think when we were working together in Oakland, and this idea of full service community schools, to understand that schools are the place where children eat, the place where families sometimes go for shelter. I think about these times when we're struggling in the Bay Area with the combination of COVID, the hottest times in the history of the state, and now in terrible air quality, where schools are a place of refuge and resource. And that shouldn't just be in a pandemic and extreme circumstances, but we are in extreme circumstances in terms of quality of education, focusing on young people of color and young people who are most marginalized. And so when we think about positive youth development, building on the strengths and assets of young people, not just focusing on their deficits, young folks who come into the juvenile justice system or the child welfare system are not just bundles of deficits. In fact, we often judge them on the worst thing they've ever done. And if people did that to us, we'd be in a bad shape. But these young people are bundles of assets and strengths. And they have, we all joke on these Zooms, especially early on in the pandemic, that we had to have our children help us figure out how to do it. I know that was true for me. And so that same strength that they have, even young people with some of the most dire circumstance who on paper look like they have not performed well, those mothers and grandchildren are still turning to those children saying, help me get on this Zoom, right? And so we have to utilize those strengths that those young people have to help them have a high quality education.
Yeah, I think just the appreciation I have for the stance that all of you bring to this, but just in particular, thinking about young people as powerful agents and shapers of their reality, and how we can move towards that vision of them as whole and healthy. So I appreciate that very much, David. And I think the other thing that I want to amplify here is that we're talking about a kind of learning that is not just bounded inside the school, but the school idea is one that we take responsibility for across the community. And Stephen, if you could talk a little bit about what designing for learning anywhere, anytime looks like, and how having that disposition can help heal and transform communities. I appreciate it.
Well, I would say that design, as a designer, the thing that I think about the most is structure. And what I've noticed is that the structure that we've designed for community-wide education is functioning pretty much the way it was designed. We have a school board that's responsible for schools. We have a city council that is responsible for, sewage and trash collection and things like that, and also making other policy decisions. We have Parks and Recreation that's responsible for athletic programming and all kinds of programming. And what we don't have is we don't have the place where all those things are connected. So I keep thinking more and more that in order for us to get to this ubiquitous kind of learning that we all care so much about, it's one thing to look at the grassroots and look at civic activism. At the same time, I'm feeling like it might be useful for us to also look at the grass tops and to see how the structure exists now that actually perpetuates an isolated, segmented way of looking at learning. And it's once we break down those barriers so that we don't think about a school anymore, we think about a learning community, then I think from an urban design perspective, we can switch the conversation. In some ways, I think that the notion of schools as centers of community, in hindsight, I know we've all been working this for a long time, but we might have gotten it backwards. It might be useful for us to think about the community as the center of the school, that the school is everywhere, that it's ubiquitous. And even in terms of its physical design, that we need to break down those barriers. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make a school into a community center. And I guess maybe I'm interested now to try to figure out how to make a community hub as a community center, as a hub for learning, a hub for community-wide learning. So that's in a way. I was just listening to what other people were talking about: civic activism, the notion of the sort of systemic racism. I believe that we're experiencing is really just one of many manifestations of a systemic problem that we have, which is one where we've isolated so much of our strength. And we don't get that synergy that happens when a school board works collaboratively with the city council, that works collaboratively with Parks and Recreation, so that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
I really appreciate that. And I think that centering community is really part of the 3.0 move. And Elaine, I'm going to turn to you and kind of building on notions of apprenticeship, learning by observing and pitching in and being part of communities that are more layered and deeper kinship and other structures. And maybe a kind of a focus question for you around how important is belonging and relevant learning to young people in your experience?
Sure. The first part, that's easy. It's very important. It's everything. It's sort of the baseline for everything. I would say, riffing off of what Stephen just said, which I really appreciate because it's a point of tension for me. I've thought a lot about as we all have here, around this idea of community schools and if it can all fit in a school. Because to David's point, I think about schools being full service. I mean, they are, and they always have been. They aren't funded to do it, and they're not recognized for doing it, but they do it, and we're seeing that now. You see everything shut down, and all of a sudden the whole public is saying, oh, looks like schools are the ones to provide the food, the nutrition, the technology. We didn't realize schools were doing so much, or that they were supposed to. But that looks different in one community than it does in another community. And so when you see the way schools are funded, the way schools operate, the way they're administered, how could you fit a whole community, all the assets of a whole community into a school? Like, so I have questions about that, and the idea of flipping it is interesting, particularly when you talk about the notion of youth and what they need. Schools have not been designed to serve the developmental needs of children and youth. They just aren't designed that way. If you were to overlay, in fact, the developmental needs of youth and children all along their stages and ages, you'd see all the breaking points and all the ways in which schools are not structured, culturally and structurally. They're not designed to serve those needs of the kids. So there's big issues for me, not just around youth and what youth need, which if you're looking at adolescence, it's extensions and exposure to an outside world, not just the school. So the idea of it breaking it out of the school, I don't know if that means it's a community hub where the school sits, or the schools containing the community. We have to find ways of doing that, and intentional approaches, the community schools model or strategy, where there are intentional approaches to connecting schools to home and to community institutions, and to both. Really, you're talking about museums and libraries and small businesses, all of it. If we were able to do that effectively, then you could do some asset mapping. That would be one way of seeing, for example, which communities don't have those things. If we were looking at it all, you'd see pretty clearly, pretty quickly, and you wouldn't just assume, oh, the school will do that, because as we know, it's just the inequities are massive when you look at how hyper-segregated our cities, our communities are right now.
Thank you. Yeah, and this is where it will get interesting. We'll get through this round and then kind of think about this new notion of community schools. And Pedro, I'm going to move to you in terms of this leadership idea, and what does it mean to lead with a holistic idea of the whole healthy child, and what does it demand of our leaders and people who are sitting in places of responsibility? What does it look like to lead for this work?
Thanks, Tony, for the question. And I think, first and foremost, you have to establish core values and an understanding that educating our communities are absolutely a holistic endeavor. And until, at the state chief level, or superintendent's level, or school building principal level, if you have not acknowledged that you can't properly or you can't engage children in instruction if you haven't addressed many of the other life systemic community barriers and challenges that exist, then you're really going to have to self-reflect around what it is and where it is that we're serving. And so for us at a leadership level, we had to understand that if we were going to focus on equity, all things equity, and everything that we do through that lens of equity, we had to acknowledge that there were systemic issues, there were systemic barriers, there were community needs that had to be addressed as part of educating the students holistically. And in doing that, you also had to acknowledge the fact that education systems couldn't do this on their own. We had to engage other agencies, other partners. We had to engage the community. We had to engage those that we were, that we were entrusted to serve, to also be stakeholders in this space. And that, for some is extremely challenging. I mean, there's some vulnerability when you open the door and tell folks in advance, here's what we're looking to do, and here's our focus. Here's what resources we have and how we're looking to allocate them. And then bringing them back time after time to engage in that decision-making process. So, I think, first, if you're committed to this, there is also a sense of freedom in that collective, distributive decision-making and responsibility. But there's also some vulnerability and being open and honest around, what you're trying to do, what you're able to do, and what sometimes some of the systemic, barriers that exist are. And, as was shared earlier by both Elena and Stephen, from what I heard, some of those are by design. Some of those are historically, been in place and by design, and others are, are barriers that have just erected because, individuals didn't know better and were only looking within their silos. But first and foremost is creating that vision, being strategic, and then thinking about this collective movement around educating students holistically, very organically, and involving the community as a whole.
Yeah, I think the vision piece becomes really, really important. And this idea of what we all hold and what we're aspiring to, what we want to be true in this kind of the vision of Community Schools 3.0, and the idea that we could design and actually intentionally create healthy communities where everyone belongs. And I think as an educator, I do believe that this place called school, or this kind of set of relationships of learning, could in fact be a place that we transform into a place that has opportunity for everyone to both get what they need and demonstrate their gifts and talents and create new forms of learning and knowing. And I think I hold what Angela Glover Blackwell says, that equity is a superior growth strategy, right? That the histories of extraction, anything that's built on extracting eventually collapses. Once you've extracted everything, you've exhausted it. And the idea that equity is a way of knowing, developing, creating, generating new knowing, and in new relationship, we create new opportunities. So it is now an open question to move in a little deeper about what would it look like to create these new relationships. What's required? What's the opportunity that you see from where you're sitting? And I'll navigate the conversation here, but really just opening it up for you to begin to engage with each other. And this is the start of a conversation. I think this is going to be ongoing, and you're going to be hearing more from each other as we continue. But so to open that up, what does it look like? What's it going to take? What's the vision? What does it look like to bring this to life?
If I may,
Jose and then David.
I love to, Pedro, what you talked about, the values incorporated. So these values of investing and trusting relationships, because what it really takes is the denial of self. We talk about schools to build off of what Elena was saying. People often forget the first name, community. Schools is the place where this can happen, because anytime you build a community, Malo, you probably know this best, you build a community, oftentimes if you're going to have families around there, you're thinking about the school place. So it's a central focus where school could be the very center of creating a flourishing community where people feel like they belong, where people collectively come together for the greater good of their neighborhood or their community or their local area, and they all begin to thrive. So I always have these 3 Ps. You got to remove the politics, personalities, and personal agendas. But in order to do that, you got to have a consistent strategy or a consistent vehicle where people are always interacting with one another, thinking about doing something else, doing something for something other than themselves, here, and including other people into the space. So I'll try and be brief there.
We'll keep building on it. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, although I don't yet have a vision, but I have some challenges and then some vision-ish stuff. One vision of a kind of a different justice model that produced this success to have a diversion program for young people arrested for felonies that will not go into the criminal justice system. So at the point of arrest, police divert these young people immediately into something called the Neighborhood Opportunity and Accountability Board. So you have community leaders, pastors, business owners, formerly incarcerated folks, victims of previous crimes sit as a panel. The idea is to take the administration of justice back to the days of village councils and council of elders who sit in circle and adjudicate and come up with a restorative intervention without incarceration as an option. And in these circles that, you know, we didn't design to be virtual, but that's what they are now. In these virtual circles, young people and their family engage in the discussion of what they need, how could they ensure that no other kind of harmful behavior occurs. And we had a young man arrested for, you know, relatively serious offense, and the Oakland Police Department decided to divert this young person to a non-punitive approach. But during the school discussion, it was fascinating. This was just last week. He said, "I don't like school. I'm bored of it." He said, "My teachers don't care about me. They don't want us." He said, "They just want us to listen to them for an hour and we don't talk." And then when we asked him questions, some old held assumptions by some of the group of, "Oh, is the work too hard? Is he distracted because of, you know, learning?" He said, "The work is pretty easy. If they just gave me the work, I'd just do it and be done with it." And the more you talk, the more you realize this was a pretty bright kid. He said, "I just have a hard time paying attention sometimes because of how boring this is," right? And it was just fascinating. And then when a teacher who's actually, or a retired teacher is a part of this council, asked him, "Well, have you had a teacher you like?" He said, "Oh, I had this one teacher who I loved, who was interested in me. We had discussions." He went on and on about this teacher that he really loved. And then she asked him, "Well, how is this online format working?" He said, "Actually, it's a lot better than going in school and listening to, you know, 6 teachers talk for an hour." It was just, you know, he should have been on this panel, quite honestly. It was fascinating listening to this young man. And so I say that to say, one, that experience, as we all know, is true for so many young people. Here's a young person who lives in a challenging neighborhood, has had this, you know, interaction with police, could, in a normal situation, be in the juvenile justice system, inside a facility that has really questionable schools. It's a whole nother discussion about the schools inside facilities. But what is the right kind of way of education for this young man who is comfortable with technology, who has some, you know, potentially has some issues of attention span, but who is incredibly bright, has all this capability, whose mother is struggling but doing all she can. She works, she has 3 children. And so what's the right type of community education where teachers can both come to him through technology and otherwise, and this family can receive the right type of support? The last thing I'll just say at this, I'm fascinated that, you know, the jury's out, but I'm fascinated by what Mayor Breed in San Francisco announced yesterday with these community hubs, that the Department of Children, Youth and Family, was an announcement not by the school district, but by the Department of Children, Youth and Family Services, to have a series of community hubs where young people can come have in-person instruction, in-person learning, and families can get service and supports from an array of community-based organizations and government agencies. And they plan to have 100 of them throughout the city. So this is fascinating to see how that works out.
Yeah, and I think the history there of creating, obviously, lots of opportunity to connect the beacon centers. There's a long history in San Francisco that I think they're kind of returning to in some ways. And so, Selena, I want to invite you into this in terms of some of the policy and the creative opportunities that individuals can have in shaping policy that's more inclusive and developing kind of places of care. So given your long history in leadership and investment in kind of strengthening agency, how are you thinking about this work now?
Well, so I think it's an incredibly difficult moment, as everyone has already addressed. But I think there are some things that are being brought to light that teachers would be the first to say need to be brought to light. I'll very quickly just say, so my background right now, I'm the executive director of Grantmakers for Education. I run a network of those in philanthropy. For 10 years before this, I ran Teach Plus, a network of teachers. And so I think teachers are the ones who, you know, over the course of the past decade or more, have been the most vocal about the growing expectations that are put on teachers now more than ever. and that there are parts of the social system that are not addressed that fall to teachers. One point I think that always has stuck with me. So Sarah Goldrick-Rab is a researcher at Temple, and she's the foremost scholar on the topic of student basic needs at the post-secondary level. So this is a huge issue at the post-secondary level, looking into food insecurity, looking into housing insecurity, looking into the mental health needs of students. And I asked her at one point, so who's the foremost researcher? Who does this research at the K-12 level? And she said, it is not researched. And so that was just prior to COVID. And all of a sudden, I think society, not the people on this call because we were ahead of the curve, but society in general said, geez, now we really recognize that some of the most important things that are happening in schools are meeting the food and housing and safety needs of our students. And so that to me is a really important shift in society. I won't get too political and say there are really important people who are not noticing that, and I think that's a problem. And so what I'm watching really carefully is just the way leaders are leaning into this moment and saying, you know, what you are seeing, what we are starting to recognize in the larger society is right for us to recognize. And we need to ask some really important questions, I think, about if now we are using technology more, and I'm going to say something that's controversial with the unions, is there a way for us to maybe in some school districts, you know, have a 4-day week? That was Al Shanker's idea before it was mine. And have teachers work a 4-day week and use technology on the 5th day. Maybe that frees up some dollars for high need schools that really need additional supports coming out of this crisis for counseling services, for basic needs. So that's the way I think about the coming puzzle pieces, especially given that we are going to be in a certain financial crunch over the coming years.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the kind of creativity and really designing from what young people need and what healthy community looks like, I think has to be an open question, and all of us kind of pulling in. And Malo, I do have a question for you about in design processes, how can we not reproduce inequity in the very way we set up our design process? I mean, you guys are all raising these powerful questions, but we're kind of constrained by existing ways. So how do you think about a more generative and just design that could help us get there?
That's a big question and an important one. Obviously, you have to look at power and racial dynamics and white supremacy and the history of segregation. I mean, all of those things we've discussed today and will continue to discuss. You have to think about building off Celine's point of technology. What role can technology play in leveling the playing field in terms of getting people's perspectives? Thinking about the processes that are in place, and by nature of these older processes, eliminate people from participating, whether it be language barriers, time of day, who called the meeting. You know, I can go on and on about those things. So it's being conscious of all those things. And, you know, I don't want to duck the question, but I think from my perspective, it's also having much of what was said already, I agree with, but, you know, from my own perspective, it's a health equity lens of really understanding that from an actual physical, mental health perspective, the school is only as healthy as the community. So thinking about what many of my colleagues have just discussed is, how do we think about food insecurity and housing, and many of them doing great work tied to that, but the level of violence and the exposure to violence. I mean, you talk to children, whether it be in Harlem or East Oakland, California, south side of Chicago, the amount of violence that they see on a day-to-day, and the kind of impacts of that, right? And so understanding that schools can play such a major role in people's lives by having this health equity lens of then thinking about the built environment. So getting back to the processes and the actual environment itself is thinking about the role of the school and how it's designed, the streets that lead up to it, the open space or lack thereof, the abilities for physical activity, procurement. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities. And getting back to your main point, Tony, is around the decision making or the process. When you think about planning, so coming from an urban planning or a city planning perspective, planning by itself is supposed to be a democratic process, right? And so it really requires everyone to be a part of that. But I think breaking down these old ways of just saying, I'm having a meeting at 2 o'clock, on Friday or what have you, and thinking of there are multiple forms to get information from people. And we see that, at least even in my children's school with COVID-19, and lots of different ways of getting feedback, some online, offline, right? The old way of writing letters. And so I think we can be much more creative thinking of technology and thinking outside the box, but being conscious of what we're discussing now, the anti-Black racism that you see in society, the denying of opportunities for Black and brown bodies, and acknowledging that and saying these systems were not designed. I think it was Jose who said best earlier, it was not designed for us, so to speak, but we have to think of it starting with your quote today, of just starting fresh, right? This opportunity to teach something new, and so we have that opportunity.
Can I build on that a little bit, Tony?
Sure.
Sure. So great point. This kind of goes into what Stephen was saying as well too. Really creating not just the systemic structure across core anchor institutions, cities, counties, universities, school districts, but creating an ecosystem where they are fed information from local communities so they can co-design the right policies in order to achieve equity. So what does that look like? So Multnomah County, Portland, Oregon, if you guys are on there's 6 school districts that are supported, began their community school initiative a few decades ago, and they went from supporting 7 hubs of the community schools, to over 90 by blending and braiding existing tax dollar funds to support local innovation that then informs the institutions of better policy making. We followed suit in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when I was a local field. I like to call a joint power of agreement the marriage certificate, right? We have some collaboration, and we have these MOUs, but a JPA, a joint power of agreement, lasts past election cycles. So we've seen it sustainable. How do you know a system works, if it's going to work or not, or sustain? Well, you leave it and see if it does. So luckily, thank God that Albuquerque grew when I left. But you have the city, the county, the school district, which is one of the largest in the country, the United Way, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, work in the University of New Mexico, collectively working together, blending and braiding their resources, their funding streams, their human capital, the human capital they have across 33 currently community schools across the country. But the way information flows so that they can better inform policy has led to, I know when I was here, about 15 different policies with 1 no vote across 3 organizations, city, county, and school district. So we're seeing this grow across the country right now. In my new role as the Coalition for Community Schools, for those who are new to it, is a network of hundreds of communities and thousands of leaders, professionals and advocates for community schools on there. And so right now during COVID, we've been conducting town halls every Tuesday, March to May, and then a month-long conference that several people in here got a chance to participate in, Tony and Pedro. And what we're learning by engaging all those places and leaders is that family engagement is at its all-time highest. We thought about it all wrong. We tried to get people to come to a place, and we call it that engagement. With technology right now, there are districts engaging thousands of people. Buffalo, who already had a system of community schools together, 20 plus, across Buffalo, and we're already convening people physically on Saturdays across 20 locations or plus. When it shifted towards, when COVID came and everything shut down, they just said, well, what if we tried to use technology? And started instantly engaging thousands of parents every Saturday, learning from them of what works best for their children. Now, it doesn't take away from the hardest to reach populations. Immigrant, refugee populations that David was talking about. David, I used to be a juvenile detention reform coordinator, so I get it. I get it, and I actually visited the Oakland schools at one point when I was doing that. But I get it. So how do we? The push is, if you use the first name first, community. What we learned in Houston from another teenager another teenager in Houston during this engagement, is that some places who didn't have technology, where there were language barriers, where schools were struggling to reach people to cram in the learning piece and identify what the care pieces are, the young people stepped up because they already had a structure where they met frequently, a community school. Young people says, well, I know so-and-so, I know so-and-so. I'm gonna reach out by phone. I'm gonna tell them what we're talking about right now, and I'll bring back what they're saying as well too. So I think what it could look like is creating this ecosystem where core anchor institutions blend and braid their resources, just like we're asking neighborhoods to do. We're asking neighborhoods to bring their will, wealth, and wisdom to the table, but how they are informed systemically by the multiple local communities across the geography.
I like that. I'm going to invite Ashley to respond, because so much of what the last two folks have said is where you're kind of located and what you've been trying to bridge and build. But what are some of your reflections?
I think going back to the comments before about the design process and how that needs to change, I think a reinvigorated design process demands that we are better students of history in the communities that we're working with. I think so often there's this sense of urgency to get to action, and that comes, I think, from a good place generally. But in doing so, we skip over the hard and really important work of understanding the histories, the stories, the legacies of communities, and understanding the policies and the decisions that got us to where we are today. And when we skip over that piece, then we create new solutions that are insufficient at best. I think of I'm not sure if folks saw it, but the National Community Reinvestment Coalition released a great project recently where they took the historic redlining maps and we're looking at present day health inequities. And it's such a powerful data visualization that if you're not a student of that history, if you haven't really gone back to understand how we got to where we are today, then you just sort of come up with solutions and you think, oh, this is it. We've cracked the case, and you miss so much nuance in that. So I think that being also a student of history with community engagement, I think is a really critical piece of this conversation.
Elena?
Thank you. Yeah, that so resonates, Ashley. Thank you for sharing that resource. I think I had just seen it, so it's still in my head. A couple of things I wanted to make a note of. At New America, we have a program on teaching, learning, and technologies where theoretically, the base of it, with my colleague Lisa Guernsey, these are her words, but she focuses on human-centered technology. And so I just think this idea of a shift where we're thinking about technology as essential, like we're not trying to ignore it. It is a tool, we need it. It's ubiquitous. We need it kind of everywhere to drive our systems, support our systems. But the idea that it be human-centered, that it's driven by human, it's in service of humans, is really important. And a lot of the connections that we're making on the work we're doing programmatically and on the policy front are using that as a lens. And then the second thing, the theory generally about schools being isolated and disconnected from communities more so than they should be. So this idea that we would bring that together, we would connect. There's two pieces to that. One is that we need the youth and the children to be I don't want to say let free of the schools, but to be able to get outside of just the box of school, because we have created that way, then it can be isolating from that for them. And at the same time, we need to pull people into the school. So it's both directions. And so we have two things. One, and I think you'd mentioned this, Tony, when you first asked the question around apprenticeship. We have a big youth apprenticeship initiative that is centered on this idea that, particularly in adolescence, the 4-year design of high schools is arbitrary. It comes from nowhere. I mean, we trace the history, we know where it comes from, but it's not based on anything. And this idea that at a certain point, these youth need to get out into the community. They need to have the internships. They need to have these opportunities out there. And we need structured, very formalized partnerships between K-12 and higher education institutions and employers and businesses and nonprofits in the public sector that can provide those opportunities and the mentors that these young people need. So that's one thing. And then on the other flip side of that theory, where we're pulling people into the schools, we have a big initiative around Grow Your Own Educators, which is primarily focused on making sure that we get paraprofessionals, and this is aligned with our work on English learners and bilingual educators, where we have huge shortages. You take those paraprofessionals, you get them up into teaching, which is what they want to do. You're pulling folks from the community into the schools, and making those connections much more formalized. So I just mentioned that as two practical strategies that we're trying to advance, both programmatically, but also on the policy front.
Thank you. And Pedro, I'm going to, in terms of kind of embodying all these kinds of partnerships, you're about to take on a new leadership role in higher ed, and thinking about the pre-K through higher ed and connecting the community and the STEM hubs in Pennsylvania. Like, how are you thinking about all those connections that Elena is kind of raising, like all that available to young people and us organizing around them?
Yeah, absolutely. First piggybacking from the first question and transitioning to this one, I think now is the perfect time. The first and foremost, the pandemic has absolutely created an unmentionable, set of, barriers and frustrations and challenges. So as the instances of civil unrest and all the deep conversations that are taking place around, around race and systems and everything else that's been going on. But as a result of leaders coming to the table and trying to address and answer and hold themselves responsible to, the response of the current conditions, I think, opportunities like community schools and the community school movement or momentum are this is the perfect breeding ground for that. I'll take a half a step back, but March 13th, Friday, March 13th, when we shut down all of our schools, as a result of COVID-19, and started to work to address, some of the issues that existed on day one. There were lots of lessons learned. I mean, for folks like us, we weren't surprised, but we knew that first and foremost we had to address this issue of food security. When you think of when we closed schools on March 13th to the end of the traditional school year, here in PA, we served more than 12.4 million meals after the pandemic. So, when folks ask us if there was a need, there was absolutely a need. And then, secondly, we look to address, systemic disparities of health access and availability. So we worked with the Department of Human Services to tackle that issue. We brought in Department of Agriculture to tackle the issue of food security. We worked with DHS to provide SNAP benefits for any family who qualified for free reduced lunch. No questions asked. We mailed them cards, and then our governor worked with food distributors to allow families to use SNAP for food delivery. And so, all of these partners came to the table, to address an issue that was in response to a crisis. The conversations that we're having now is, why should we stop? Why should all of these opportunities and access, to resources that families should have, because those, who may not be of the greatest need, have access to all of these, resources. So why not, make them available? Why not ensure that the default is it's available, as opposed to our default always being it's not available, right? And and so we've run into some challenges at the federal level in providing this, but we're chipping away at it. And and as I transition now from a life in K-12, early childhood through K-12, and then the state, I'm in the higher ed. I'm in a really fortunate place. I mean, one of the reasons I chose the transition is because I'm going to a higher ed institution, Thaddeus Stevens, whose sole purpose is to provide access to higher education for students and families from underrepresented communities. So that's already written into the mission and the vision. And so, there's one less fight I have to have going into an institution, right? But the bigger issue is really how, do we engage with local partners who know what their local communities need to address systemic issues that have existed for generations. And what I hope to be able to do, and hopefully the legacy that I'm leaving at the state, after 5+ years, and the team that remains there is that we've shown in response to a pandemic and giving us, the pandemic allowing us the conditions and the environment to do whatever was needed, to properly serve communities. We made amazing things happen. And by the way, when you look at some of the most conservative, critics of our work, we could also prove at the same time that there was very little waste, fraud, and abuse, right? Because that's what you're always hearing. But we now have the data because we were forced to in addressing food security and addressing housing security. And I'll just kind of share one more, issue when we were looking at higher ed, in response to the pandemic and the issues of civil unrest and what was going on in communities. We identified students who were homeless. We identified students who didn't have access to food security. We identified students that didn't have access to mental health and health resources, and we worked to provide those students those resources. And so if nothing else, I hope we learned, from the past 6 months practically that, when collective minds come together in response, we're able to provide the resources that our communities need. Now, whatever the new normal looks like, the difficult part of this, it's going to require some sacrifice from those of us who have. And so that's where the conversation needs to take place right now in reminding them, your life may not go back to the exact normal that it was before, because now we're utilizing resources through the lens of equity in an equitable fashion, which means we may focus on serving first and foremost in a much more robust nature some of our most vulnerable communities, understanding that if we can level access and equity, everyone will benefit as a result. And we can already see that as folks are becoming a little more attuned to the current conditions. Those who may not have always needed all of the access and the resources they had are asking for some of that access and resources back. And leaders, it's incumbent upon us to say, hold on, let's make sure that we are working to serve those who are underserved, those who may not necessarily have a voice, those who the system has historically not engaged and produced for, and then we can work to serve those that are right in front of us at the time.
Thank you. I think the recognition that the existing system concentrates privilege and concentrates poverty, that the way it's designed is extractive and diminishes some for the benefit of a few, and that has to change. And I think picking up on the things that you were raising, Stephen, would you talk a little bit about the nexus planning, and so how we would take some of these new understandings and kind of move towards a time when we could actually design for this future that we want?
Sure. There are two words or two ideas that I really want to riff on for a minute. One of them is the word ecosystem. And I think that if we focus on the idea of ecosystem, we think differently than if we think about the parts of a system. The second thing is that we all have to come together. So I think that how we all do this together somehow is a lot less like an orchestra and a lot more like a jazz band, where everybody is riffing off of each other and that nobody plays louder than anybody else. And we all come together with all of these different ideas that come together in a complex adaptive system. And I think that at least in my view, we can't plan one thing at a time. We have to plan. We have to do physical planning while we're also working with communities to understand the cultural plan that they need, and helping them find a plan for cultural integration, for example. And we also need to be doing social planning at the same time, because we know that health and human services are all a part of this ecosystem that we're talking about. And we also need to be doing organizational planning at the same time, because we have all these different parts and a lot of people with a lot of different information and enthusiasm and programs to come together. We also need to be thinking about the economic system or the economic component of the system. In fact, we're all going to have less money, but it's not always a bad thing to have less money, because sometimes we have to learn to do two things at once, which is actually what we're talking about. And finally, the educational system, the whole notion of how learning takes place. If you put all of those together, and we can figure out how to plan at the nexus, where all of these different planning strands come together, then I think we'll get closer. And I think there have been times, and we look back at all the great examples of schools and museums. Or I saw David Abel was on the call with New Schools, Better Neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and for 5 years, there was policy introduced at the California legislature. Well, let's go find all of those, all of that information and all of that enthusiasm, and let's put it all together in a systems approach, and where everybody's involved, and we can make music.
I love it. And Celine, I think some of what Stephen is sharing is where you've been and been thinking about and supporting that kind of work. What's this making you think? He's close. You're good.
Thank you. I was having problems getting off mute.
All right.
Well, I think that, from my perspective now at Grantmakers for Education, it's exactly the way that grant makers across the country are trying to think about the system. So, number one, it's not just the education system. It's a service to the whole community. And how do we think about the education system in conjunction with all of the other social systems that support students? I think that there is a general feeling in a very challenging moment that someone just referenced the notion that sometimes less money is not a bad thing, because it really does force you to prioritize. And so I am clear-eyed about the moment that we're heading into, and I think most funders are, but also recognize that it will force some difficult conversations about how do we better align systems, how do we think about the whole child rather than the child as a academic student, and then the other dimensions of their self separately. So that's mostly what I'm hearing is, a moment where we can really have hard conversations and come out the other side with a more logical system and a more human system.
You got a lot of head nods going. A lot of people feeling that. It just, I think, David, I'm going to pick up something that this idea that the assets and strengths and moving to a place where we're asking a very different question about how is this young person smart, or what are their gifts, rather than how smart are they. Like this, just a reframe on understanding and being in relationship with young people. I mean, how could we bring that more into the center of the conversation for educators, do you think?
Yeah, I think that is a critical piece of it, because so often, like all of the time, when I work with people who have initial interactions, who don't work in the juvenile justice field, and they either go into a facility or they facilitate a group of young people, I get the same response all the time. Wow, this group is a sharp young folk, like that. There's a lot going on there. There is a question about the assumption of why they weren't. But there's also the issue of, why the assumption given their circumstances, right? And that it's not an issue of capability at all. It is an issue of resource level, institutional oppression and racism, and an old, tired system of education that we all acknowledge. And so how do we take a young person, a full young person, their family, their community, fully capable, fully able, with all of these assets, and yes, some challenges that they need support with and for. But the other thing is, how can we look at models that have succeeded in helping such young people? For instance, credible messengers, right? So there is, for a long time, call them life coaches or mentors, maybe sometimes case managers, but largely called credible messengers now, people with similar lived experiences as the young people they're going to serve, whether grew up in that neighborhood or had similar backgrounds or circumstances, who've turned their lives around and can be this a beacon of hope, light, and navigation for these young people that we need to use there's some school districts that occasionally use people like this to, as, alternative truancy officers to go get kids to get, butts in the seats for attendance, for funding, right? But what if we use them for real engagement, development, and help with that family and those students? The program I mentioned earlier, this Neighborhood Opportunity Accountability Board, we have life coaches. To be honest, this wasn't our original intent, but with COVID, so we have life coaches going into the home with the PPE and social distancing, making sure, okay, where's the laptop, or how can you use your phone effectively? And they're navigating with the school. We have this huge issue of the school has Chromebooks for everyone, but can't just seem to get them to the young people who need them the most, right? And so we have these credible messengers coming in and helping with all of those pieces to make sure they're getting the Chromebook from the school, going to the house, helping them set it up, helping the parents or family or guardians work with the student on it. And if we could fund this, in fact, the current state superintendent of instruction, who I've known for a long time in California, who I've known for a long time, another Tony, who he proposed this to me 15 or so years ago when I was talking about social impact bonds of how about we fund credible messengers to engage students, and the funding back was in terms of increasing attendance, increasing funding for schools. But what if we did it in terms of engaging young people's development, their family, their community, and in so doing increase employment for a group of people, adults with potentially criminal records who have a bunch of ability and who could help here, and you have an incredible win-win when we do it that way.
Yeah, I just will amplify this notion of the cataracts of racism in our current system don't see a lot of those assets.
Yeah.
That we're unable to see the funds of knowledge and gifts and opportunity because of the limit. And I think that's kind of what I was getting at. Like, what's the encouragement and the activity now in new design that says, how do we see and understand human being in different and more complex ways, and really design education around that? I kind of, at this moment, there's so many different strands, and the one other piece, Elena, I'm going to kind of draw you back in around apprenticeship in particular, like this idea of becoming kind of more capable over time, and kind of this legitimate learning that is to mastery, but it's also that the person who knows something is learning from the learner also. Like, there's a relationship in apprenticeship that I think we want to have in the middle of whatever new design for learning. And kind of what's your thinking about that?
No, absolutely. It's a sort of a two-way street. What we hear a lot, it can be difficult in the apprenticeship models, and this is a youth apprenticeship model in particular that we're talking about starting in high school. So we're talking about high school students who are getting their post-secondary credential of some sort, also working paid work. They are employees, but there are some challenges in trying to get the employers ready to work with young people. It's not their world. They don't understand it. They're sort of into it. They'll do it, but they're a little bit, sometimes they can be a little cautious about it. And while it's true, we need to make sure that the employers are prepared to work with youth. There's what we've seen the most of are these like moments where the employers themselves are like, it's just changed my work because I'm so motivated now, because they come in and they bring this like all these questions, and they love to, this mentorship relationship really goes both ways. And so it's improving the culture of the workplace. And a lot of these employers have then, they keep these young people on, they end up paying for their colleges. I mean, they have like employment. Those are obviously the success stories, which aren't all of them, but it is a pretty amazing model when you see that happen both ways. And you see the young people say they're trusted in the workplace, and that trust is something they don't feel in school. The teachers don't trust them. The leaders don't trust them. Nobody trusts them. They go in there, they're supposed to sit, do their work. They don't have a sense of empowerment or a sense that they're trusted as independent people. And that's all about adolescent development. They need a lot of structure, and they need, in the parallel, a lot of independence, and giving them both at the same time, which is the challenge as a parent, teacher, anybody who works with young people. You see that constant tension of trying to give them autonomy, but also make sure you give them the support and structure that they need. The only other thing I'd offer, because we focus on birth all the way up to the workforce, is that a lot of this conversation around community schools and these models has to also focus really on those younger years, because from what we see, it is in the earliest spaces, those youngest years, where you see the parents, they're with their kids, they're holding their kids, and they're coming in to the schools or to the community centers, and that's you see that sort of baked into the way people behave. Once, you know, I've got teenagers, they're separate from me, and so we get used to it. By the time they're at a certain age, we get used to, like, they're doing their thing, I'm doing my thing. So I just would encourage us also to make sure we're focusing on those really early years where you have opportunities to, and a lot of 2-gen models that you see in some schools, where you can pull parents and the youngest children in to make sure that from the beginning they have the strongest supports they can have.
Yeah, and I think that's where the kind of expanded learning, thinking about the entire community as the place of learning and the relationships, and maybe it's coordinated by the school and kind of navigated. And, you know, I think big picture learning in Blaze and kind of managing partnerships and relationship, there are some good platforms. But
no maybe about it though. There'd be no baby. It is coordinated, and that's what it takes. And we talk about because it has to be intentional. So one thing I want to bring us back to, if I may, is this discussion about equity. We're getting a lot in the structure and the system and the gotta-dos in here, and I might call on you, my brother Malo, a little bit here. But hey, some common sense things, right? If you have a neighborhood of people who have a health desert, they got to go somewhere to get basic health needs. Why are we closing down 2,500 health centers across the country right now in the middle of a health pandemic? Why are we doing that? Why are we not trying to open up more places in neighborhoods where they can get primary care and maybe even turn it to test centers? I don't know. If you have 24,000 places we call Title I schools, but on paper are in poor communities, why are we not using that infrastructure to tool up, train up, and support adults to get them out of that, to break intergenerational poverty? That's why we have the big goal of 25,000 community schools, or 25,000 coordinated places. Why are we not doing that? If we have neighborhoods where there is violence, why are we not having coordinated efforts where we're bringing what David was talking about? You know, I grew up on the South Side of Chicago, single mother. I got 5 children myself, so I understand gang members are non-traditional leaders. They influence an entire neighborhood and community, but under what, to build off of what Lena is saying right there, but under some love and some intentional, continuous, positive adult interactions. And I keep bringing home continuous. This is not some one-off stuff. So yes, it has to be a coordinated effort. Somebody's job has to be, who am I going to bring together today and include young people in this conversation where they're constantly being loved? So there was a question in a Q&A, can schools be year-round? Yes. We're still in an agricultural system. I have a buddy of mine who lives in Denver, Indiana. If you knew if there was such a place, yes, there's a Denver, Indiana. But it makes sense for him and his family on an agricultural system. But growing up in a where my mom was an hourly employee, we needed more childcare. If that's what parents see it day to day, we needed more positive adults to support our work system for parents. We need more out of school time programming. We need more centralized health, workforce development, and university activities to eliminate transportation barriers, any other barrier. We need more of those coordinated systems of care neighborhood by neighborhood. That's why we're going for 25,000 community schools. We got, after COVID, yeah, it was about just under 24,000. We know it's going to be 25,000 Title I schools with so many people unemployed right now. So we actually need an infrastructure, a national infrastructure to support that. I'm gonna get off my soapbox, Tony. I'm gonna put myself on mute.
Oh, I think we're all up on the box, man. I think everybody here is like, yeah. But and coming back to this notion of authentic equity as a way of being in relationship with, that's trusting, loving, and learning how to love across difference and not understanding. I mean, that's why I do think, I mean, learning requires this equilibrium. Like I used to know something, and now I don't know something, and now I'm gonna learn something else. Like that's what we're trying to create. You go ahead.
One more thing, one more thing, and I'm gonna shut up because we got 15 minutes left. So I'm one of the blessed. I think we're all blessed, but super blessed coming from a neighborhood out of Southside Chicago and have a chance to play professional sports. And somebody said the other day, that, you know, who was the athlete said professional sports are a microcosm of America today. I mean, you cannot escape a locker room with diversity, all kind of issues that are happening around our country. Young people, as a young person growing up in that sports culture, I had to face homosexuality. I had to face racism. I had to face ableism. I had to face classism on a daily basis where it's in your face and you cannot thrive and succeed together without addressing your own biases and the biases of your teammates, or else you will not become a team. And Tony, you're a former professional athlete also, and you know those teams where we were able to get the ring and be champions up did that well, addressed them and built a trusting relationship, understanding each other's differences. And those teams that did not, the losing seasons, we didn't do it well. So we have a lot to learn. How would that look like neighborhood by neighborhood, school by school, community by community?
Yeah, I have to go to Malo on this. So we were part of some conversations specifically about that, Jose, starting in 1995-ish. Kind of some book stuff came out of it, but I think thinking about the ways that we get into relationship and learn by being close and having shared work shaped our relationship, certainly, but kind of some of our understandings. So maybe just pick up on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's hard about Jose. I mean, he broke it down, but I would say that, touching on some of the things that were said earlier from Elena and Ashley, and, and knowing your history, being able to reflect on where you come from, your positionality, and being able to understand difference and have that open mind. And so I think right now calls for that time of reflection for all of us, right? To think about how we contribute to the problem, how we're trying to be a part of solving the problem, but more importantly, understanding how each community has these different needs and histories, and it's complex, but being willing to roll up your sleeves and get involved and understand all these other dynamics. And I think that's where it's really hard, right? But if you're able to break that down and start to see people as humans and touch on that, connect on the human level, you could start to make a difference. Because, I do work outside of not just education, but certainly, around development around the world. I've never gone to a vulnerable community or underserved community that says, I don't want investment. I don't want good quality of life. I don't want access. They all do. I've never met a community that says, I don't want that. They want the same things, but what they differ on is how they can go about getting it. They want to be at the table. They don't want you bringing the chain when they already have the mom and pop that's already there. They want to not look at them as having the problems, but understanding where the strengths are. And so it's about creating that ability for us to come together, but more importantly, to understand all these different dynamics. And that's the hard part, right? How do you implement these things for it to really make a difference? And it has to start with looking at people as humans and as human beings. And I just want to end on one point about young people and the importance of health equity. Again, the data from public health is overwhelming about sort of looking at the last trimester of pregnancy all the way through certainly the formative years of really the importance of investing early on and the kind of impacts it has, not just in the short term, but in the long term of people's lives. So if you look at these longitudinal studies in terms of then what happens to people long term, obviously people are resilient and if things happen early on, you can still bounce back, but it is making those important investments. And part of that is seeing all people as humans, understanding that they have the same wants, the different challenges or similar challenges, and being able to work together. That's hard to do.
Yeah, it is. Ashley, I think maybe we'll start a kind of round of wrapping up, and each person saying what's a kind of a key high leverage activity to move to this 3.0 idea of community schools. And you've been really focused on interrupting cycles of poverty, integrating systems. What are some of the things that you would suggest, or a key thing you would suggest as we go forward?
Well, I think at a basic level, and this is so much easier said than done, is working together. And you know, when if you're a school district and you're going to do a community listening session, you know, invite the city and the housing authority and the hospital system, you know, bring those people, those other agencies along and say, hey, let's do this listening tour together, and then let's debrief afterwards. Or, you know, God forbid, let's do all of our budget planning together, or let's develop our bonds together. That's my dream, I think, for the school district, the city, the community college district, for them all to sit around a table and co-plan their bonds so that we're leveraging dollars in ways that we aren't currently. So I think it's a simple thing, but a really difficult thing, and it's bring other agencies, organizations, people to the table so that you're having more of a collective effort as opposed to, you know, a siloed one.
I like it. Stephen, what would you say?
My feeling is that we have to really double down on embracing the complexity, and understanding that what we're taking on is something that's so much bigger than any of us. It's not bigger than all of us. But I think that the points that have been made already about there's the grass tops, that there's the political infrastructure that we all put in place in our governance. But that's upside down, because the people who really need to be empowered to make the decisions are the people in the community. And so to me, there's a sweet spot there. There's a kind of a Venn diagram where the grass tops and the grassroots come together, and that's where the power is. And I don't feel like we quite know how to do that yet. But I feel like if we can focus on that, just how do we do that, then I think maybe all of these parts might come together in some way.
Thank you. Elena?
Thanks. First of all, just thank you all. It's been great just to see your faces and have the conversation. So I appreciate the opportunity. I guess I have been talking about some of the initiatives I mentioned as schools as part of community and economic development. I think that's the moment we're in right now, where that's what we can grasp and leverage as an argument, a narrative to support this, because my concerns are that this has slipped and slipped and slipped. The ideas, like they just sort of, we're behind them and it just sort of slips away. We can't get the traction we need. And this is a moment. It's a different moment. I mean, for a lot of things in a lot of ways. So I do think that we could leverage the opportunity. It does require figuring out why it slipped in the past, though, like being sensitive to that. So to Ashley's point earlier about history, and I know you were talking about all sorts of histories, but even just the history and what we know about where those slips have happened and why, like why didn't things gain traction on the year-round schools, for example. There's a tremendous amount of research. I used to write about year-round schools and all the different models we could have, and a lot of them were tried. We pushed it. Federal government pushed it, you know, and it didn't work because folks didn't want to support it, because the task force didn't rise. I mean, there are reasons why some things slip in certain moments. So it's important that we just know that as we move forward. That's, I guess, the biggest takeaway I'd say for now, but a lot more to do.
Definitely more to do, and our conversation together is going to continue for sure. David, what would you say where we should focus?
Well, I just want to riff on a few other, Elena and Ashley's really good point, a point that I've tried to make forever, in this notion of working together. When you think about budgeting, if you think about the families that I've talked about, of young people from disadvantaged communities, challenging circumstances, who have millions of dollars being spent on them, right? And so if you take one of these families, and that family often has a child welfare worker, a probation officer, an IEP coordinator, 2 CBO case managers, right? That one family has all of those resources working in silos, at best just in silo, often against each other, right? With conflicting schedules. And if you don't go to the PO one, you're going to get violated. And if you don't, right? And so you have all of this. Just imagine if they worked together, or there was one who was most strength-based, asset-based, with a positive youth development lens and work, and you had all those resources to reallocate and bear to that family, we can be much more effective and productive with those resources. So if we think about school district funding and city funding and county funding and philanthropy, all coordinated and leveraged to best support the strengths and assets of those young peoples and family, we would have much better outcomes. And then we need to think about what are those better outcomes. It has to be more obviously than just test scores, but what is the youth, family, and community metrics that we are going to look to improve.
Right on. The healthy, holistic approach. And Celine, let's pick up with you. Where would we focus?
Well, I would say for those of you who really are at the intersection of those systems that support students, this is a place where philanthropy is looking for entry points for systems change, for better systems alignment, and really struggling to find those entry points. So for the people who sit at the junctures of systems, I think it's a really important time for conversations with philanthropy. And then the second thing I'll say is I just think that both Jose and Malo spoke so powerfully to how important relationships are, and really how at the center what education is relationships. And in my long-term work with teachers, that's the one thing that kind of constantly comes out, is how powerful those relationships are. But I've taught policy to non-policy wonks for a really long time. And what I always say is policy begins where relationships end. And so thinking about narrative, thinking about the voice of teachers, thinking about the voice of students to help make sure that we're informing policy to highlight and support those relationships going forward, to me is super important.
Definitely. Thank you. Pedro?
Yeah, I think, if anything, as I think about, the recent future and the longitudinal future, and this movement 3.0, I hope we don't lose sight of this opportunity. I think for the first time in a long time, communities of means know what it's like to worry about access to healthcare, know what it's like to have, to worry about access to food, know what it's like to worry about access for education. Our vulnerable communities have worried about this, for generations. And so today the conversation should be had. How does it feel to only be able to pick up 2 pieces of produce at the market because there are limitations? Well, guess what? For many families, finances are those limitations. What is it to think that you can't go to an emergency room or have access to a bed because of pandemic? Well, guess what? Many of us grew up in neighborhoods and communities where we didn't have access to healthcare. How does it feel to know that you can't go to school in person because those resources just don't exist? Well, guess what? We have communities for generations. The system has disallowed them to have access to high quality education. So, we're in a point today that every single member of American society can pretty much feel some of that pain. And so hopefully we kind of strike while the iron's hot before life gets back to normal for those, of means, and they forget what it felt like to not have access to some of what they believe are their God-given rights.
Yeah, to transform to more peace and justice, I think collectively. And Jose, I'm going to turn to you. Your thinking as you move to that community schools across the country, sitting where you are, and community schools 3.0, what's on your mind?
Well, one thing on just to echo off as far as your biggest bang for your buck, one study that we did, we saw that for every dollar that was invested in a community school coordinator, produced a $7.11 return of investment as access and opportunities for children of color in local communities. To build upon what everyone else is saying, relationships. I think Ashley was right. We got to dig in, do the hard work, and that's getting to know people and actually start practicing some of these concepts that Ashley talked about together.
Well, you all are extraordinary, and really appreciate all of your work and your leadership. And Ron, just want to say thank you for asking me to be a part of this, and I know you have some closing thoughts.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks to the panelists for bringing your expertise, but also your humanity to this discussion. You were open and honest and courageous in talking about things as they are. I'd like to create just a second of context for what we're doing here. While this conversation in and of itself was terrific and valuable, it is necessary but not sufficient. So what we're doing during the COVID is we're harvesting ideas. We know that educators are in crisis right now. They're not thinking about the future. They're thinking about what's in front of them today. But there will be a time, maybe next spring, maybe next summer, where they begin to think again about the future. Our fear is either out of frustration or exhaustion, they simply go back to doing it the way they always have. So the work we're doing during the COVID is really to create ideas, strategies, and visions that might inspire those educators to lean in rather than lean back. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 5 strands that we're working on: equity, with a focus on community schools 3.0, technology, with a focus on learning at the intersection of technology and design, active and inquiry-based learning, with a focus on STEM and STEAM and maker learning. A 4th focus is on the school as a community resource during times of crisis and emergency. How can we design our schools with those repurposes in mind? And finally, the question of change itself, which all of you touched on in one way or another. We're not very good at changing our bureaucracies, and we're going to be asking for a lot of change as we come out of this pandemic. So what are the strategies for change that have worked, and how can we inspire mayors, philanthropic leaders, education leaders to really lean into change as we think about reimagining our schools? Finally, we've divided our work into 2 phases: ideas and implementation. So the work that we're doing here is not going to just be a report on the shelf, but when we're able to go back into the field, we'll resume our work with communities, with school districts, and we're currently identifying those districts today, districts that would like to learn from the work that you all are doing and the others that we're talking to are doing. So this has got direct, applicable, and tangible purpose, not just the great exploration of ideas, but then seeing those ideas put in place in community. So thanks for being a part of it. As we go forward with the discussions around equity and community schools 3.0, we'll be broadening our community of conversations, having underrepresented participants as well as those that are powerful and passionate like yourselves. And we hope maybe to circle back with some of you to dig deeper on the ideas that you've talked about today. So what a great 90 minutes, Tony. Thank you so much for bringing your leadership to this. And thanks to each of you for sharing what you bring to this important and essential conversation.